anatomy, the structure of the organs, the functions of the organs, how are they reflective of higher order processes? And that's really what the idea here is. Maybe can we expand our knowledge to be able to grasp those higher order processes? Really, Chinese medicine is all about cosmological science. If you look at the classics, it's all about rhythms. Life is really about rhythms and about how those rhythms are synchronized and harmonized in the right way. I think where a lot of scientists don't ask is, where are my hypotheses and ideas coming from? Again, most people say you're just making it up, but is it that the phenomena is speaking into you, and that if you create yourself as the right receiver, those ideas now will stimulate new activity? Have the thought and just think this and you'll be, you'll levitate the world. Well, I think there comes a point when those thoughts can very quickly translate down into matter, but you have to really transform your own matter to a very high degree to be able to do that efficiently. This is the plant thinking itself into me. Thought is a living thing, and that we're receiving it in a way. And we as human beings,
what should we be tuning into consciously?
And so you get into that experience of, how am I projecting my warmth? Even in my thinking, when you think about someone, am I being cold towards them? Am I putting warmth around them? A new age, which can reapproach that former golden age, but with new tools and with new insights and with new freedom. And I think that's really encouraging. I think that says that, it's not all doomed, although things look pretty bad at certain times. Again, I think what's happening now is more just like a melting pot that has to boil over.
And welcome to Enlivened Medicine, seeking the spirit of matter. I'm joined here today by Dr. Kalnins, who is a now retired professor of the National University of Natural Medicine. He's been in private medical practice for 20 plus years, and was a professor for, how long was it?
I think it was 16 years, yeah.
Okay, a whole 16 years. Yeah, my name is Motoyuki, and I'm in the last year of the second to last year of my education as a Chinese medicine doctor. And I was proud to have Dr. Kalnins as my teacher for part of that time. And we're really excited to kind of dive into the question today or at least start exploring, the basis of a truly integrative medicine. Yeah, we're just gonna chat and see where it takes us. So, do you have anything more you want to share?
Great. Yeah, well, no, thanks for that introduction. This is the whole purpose of this channel, or this program, or this discussion came up around our questions. You had a lot of questions for me around, the question of integration. You're studying Chinese medicine. There are a lot of people out there that might be a little skeptical of Chinese medicine and naturopathy and these things, and how does it fit in with our current understanding of science and medicine? And I personally have been really interested in trying to find a bridge between our modern scientific discourse. So, most of the courses I taught were in biomedicine, different aspects of that, the full survey course of biomedicine for Chinese medicine students, and then endocrinology for the naturopathic students. But then also understanding that there are other modes of knowing and perceiving that are a bit marginalized in our current thinking. And if we maybe bring some of those other ideas back into the discussion, we can expand science and medicine into a new direction, to get maybe new insight into how to approach some of the complex problems which we aren't necessarily dealing with very well. And a lot of those problems aren't just due to poor logistics and these kinds of things and financing and money, but it's also due maybe to our perceptions about the world and about nature and so forth. And so I think it's a ripe area for discussion, and we're finding a lot of people. I'm finding a lot of discussion out there is a bit polarizing. You know, you have the people who are more so-called science-based and so on, and then you have the people that are more in traditional medicines or natural medicine or integrative medicine, and they seem to be at odds often in their perspectives, their worldviews. But I think there's a room for a more bridging discussion. How do we find the link between these different perspectives? And I think that's really a core theme. You know, we have polarities, and this is a fundamental aspect of like Chinese medicine. You know, you have the yin and the yang, these two polarities. We can say in nature, we have the sun forces, the lunar forces, and the masculine, the feminine, and so forth. So we see things in polarity, and we're finding, obviously in politics right now, there's a real division into polarities. But I think the missing element, the crucial element, is the connecting link between those two. So it's actually a trinity. It's more you have a polarity and then you have a relationship between them. And where I would like to stand is more in that middle ground. How do we find the link? So how do we see, for example, concepts that one learns, let's say in Chinese medicine or acupuncture, how can we understand that from the perspective more of current scientific thinking? Vice versa, how can we use what we've learned in science and look at that on a more broader level to maybe find new insights and to answer different questions? So I think there's a lot of room for that kind of discussion. And so one of the motivations I have for putting this out there right now is that I don't want to be a polarizing force. I think we need to find more of that unification and that bridging. So hopefully this channel will kind of go towards that end.
Yes. Yes. Well, yes. I think unification, integration, innovation, or you might say unification and integration are the seeds of a new innovation. I think one of the questions that has come up as I've gone deeper into Chinese medicine is where do the 5 phases, or most people would know them as the 5 elements, which isn't totally accurate, but where does that fit together? How, you know, how does that manifest in modern science? You know, how does that manifest in, per se, the energy bodies of anthroposophy? What about, you know, the Western zodiac? Where does that fit in? You know, is that what level is that? How is that interacting with the organ systems of the body? Or, you know, the Chinese have, yeah. So these are like some of the questions that we've been exploring. And I know one of the frameworks that you've presented that ties all of these ideas together, whether we're talking about like the Western star systems and that influence on the body, or even like from the Chinese tradition, the I Ching, and as like a wisdom text, and where that kind of, you know, where that fits into our understanding of I guess just, you know, how does it work? Yes, where that fits into our understanding of the bigger picture of, you know, of the world. And
yeah, these are huge questions. I mean, I think, you know, going back to this idea of polarity, you know, one of the fundamental polarities we're experiencing now, but also, you know, that's a thousands-year-old discussion, is how does one connect the world, we'll just call it the world of matter, what we can perceive through our senses, you know, what we can touch, we can smell, we can taste, we can see. How do we connect that world where we have a brilliant science, you know, that describes that world? My background before becoming a naturopathic physician was in physics. And, you know, we have this incredible way of describing that material world. And then we have, you know, viewpoints that you might argue stem from a non-material or we might call it a supersensory realm, which historically has been linked to the realm of spirit. And again, you know, spirit has a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people, so we'll have to be clear about what we mean by that. But I think, you know, this connection between the sensory material world and the supersensory so-called spiritual world, how are those connected? You know, we tend to have a bit of a, in our culture, a schism between those. You know, we have religion in one and different spiritual traditions that focus on the spirit side, and we have our material science that focuses on the matter side. But if there are supersensory realms to our world, and these would be, and we can talk a lot more about that, you know, these would be maybe realms that we cannot currently measure, but we can see their effects within matter. If there are such dimensions, how are they playing out in matter? And how can we use the study of matter, for example, anatomy, you know, the structure of the organs, the functions of the organs, how are they reflective of higher order processes? And that's really what the idea here is. Maybe can we expand our knowledge to be able to grasp those higher order processes? And this is a very deep question. It's a very difficult question to answer, and it's obviously very controversial. You know, most people want to dismiss, if they're a materialist, you know, there's no spirit, there's, you know, the soul, the spirit, just a product of the matter. You know, you are just from your nerves, you are your cells. And now you hear, most recently, you are your microbiome. So you as a spiritual being really are nothing, but, you know, it's a byproduct of these other activities. Versus the more spiritual traditions might say you as an I is a core spiritual being. Actually, that is a reality. That is an essence. And that spiritual self is manifesting through matter. It's being contained by matter. It's organizing and structuring matter in different ways. And that's a much older viewpoint. But we don't hear much of that today, especially in the sciences. It's still there in the sciences, and we can come back to that discussion. You know, the most sort of historically, the latest incarnation of that idea was in vitalism, which is a very controversial topic today. It's usually, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see very clearly what people think about that, or at least the editors of Wikipedia. But this idea that there are non-physical supersensory forces above the laws of physics that organize life. That was the most recent incarnation. And we've, of course, dismissed that. We've never measured those supersensory forces. So people say, well, there are no vital forces. But we do see in living forms shapes, patterns, functions that are quite different than what we see in the inorganic world. So something is happening there. And, you know, it's a deep discussion as to what that something is. Most people say, you know, scientists would say it's a matter of complexity. You get enough things together and they start to emerge into more elegant patterns and so forth. But that is actually, although we have a few examples of that, we've never shown how a liver spontaneously arises from a collection of cells, for instance. And where, interestingly, embryology is heading is a very interesting area, finding that organs, for example, do have fields that organize their activity, and that each cell is like a particle in that field. So the cell itself has its own internal instruction set, you know, the genes, of course, but those genes are turned on and off by a variety of factors, both chemical from outside, but also potentially electrical. That's a new theory we can talk about more. But also potentially other forces that are organizing those cells into forms. So the form of a liver, for example, is actually something that doesn't exist in the physical world. It's something that we create or that we can perceive in our thinking. And that's getting closer to some of the older discussions of spirit, that spirit was more a question of understanding those forms, those energetic containers that matter fills out. And so that brings us to, you know, again, more of a bridging worldview there.
So those forms then, would we call those archetypes per se, or?
Yeah, so they've been given different names. So, you know, this, and I think this is an important discussion for, you know, we in medicine, I often hear this distinction between, you know, material medicine, what deals with matter, proteins, fatty acids, specific nutrients, you know, the stuff of life. And then people talk about energies. So in Chinese medicine, for example, we talk about qi and these different energies. And there's a lot of discussion about energy and how we want to increase our energy and absorb energy and so forth. But I think that's actually a bit of a incorrect analogy. I think it's not so much what makes us, if we're just talking about the human body, and we can get into a deeper discussion about what is a human being, and I think that could lead to something even more. But if we look at our body, we see there's specific shape and form to it. We all have roughly the same shape of the liver, and it's really interestingly, just from an embryological sense, to say, you know, you have a bunch of cells that start growing in your endoderm, and they just grow, and then they suddenly stop, and they form themselves in this pattern. And if you, for example, in the liver, injure it, you know, up to 2/3 of it, it will regenerate back to its former shape, but then it stops. And that's something that's really has not been well understood in embryology. Why does it stop? Why doesn't it just keep growing? So you just become a giant liver. Same with your other organs. So something is as if a container is holding it. So in place of energy, I might suggest that what we're really talking about are those spiritual forms. We can call them energetic forms or blueprints or archetypes, but they, you know, have to be in place in addition to the matter that fills them out. And one interesting insight, if you go down that road, is that what we're kind of treating using our herbal medicines or whatnot is not so much the matter, the cells and so forth, but rather we're trying to remind the body of the form of the organ or of the system we're trying to support. That gives a whole different dimension. So it's not about giving energy to the body. It's about directing that energy into specific patterns, patterned energy. And that's more akin, I think, to the ancient concepts of qi and so forth. And again, we're starting to see some of that resurface in conventional medicine, for example, in embryology and looking at organ forms. So that is, I think, an important distinction. You know, analogy I heard years ago, which I think is helpful there, is you can look at, for example, traffic on a busy road. And if you calculate the amount of energy that's being expended, it's enormous. So if you look at, you know, just the kinetic energy and the potential energy and the gasoline and everything. So you have all this energy, but then a stoplight, which runs on what's 12 volts or 60 volts or something, this light can stop and control that whole flow of energy. And that's how it is in the body. We have these energy flows through our biochemistry, but then specific enzymes or specific points where that energy is stopped or redirected. And the question is, what is redirecting everything? You know, and that really goes beyond the current view that everything is controlled by genes. Genes really are just the blueprints for proteins. And the proteins, of course, make your structural proteins, but also your enzymes, which drive all of your biochemical reactions. But once that enzyme is formed, how does it know when to stop or start or whatnot? And that's a complex question based on, you know, the pH and the temperature and all this. But there are other factors at work here beyond the cell. For example, the hormones coming into the cell, the neurotransmitters and the environment around the cell, which is determining how the cell will regulate its biochemistry. So it's not the gene alone which is determining that. The genes give the blueprints, but once those proteins are formed, then it's a deeper question of, you know, what is regulating all of that? And that's where those formative forces or formative activities come in. Now, in the history of vitalism, the old view, those formative forces were non-material. They were perceived as being a different force from the known forces of physics. And that view has been pretty much thrown out in medicine because those so-called supersensory forces were never measured. But we can kind of say that those forces perhaps come in and mold the physical forces. They help to shape the physical forces and determine how they're going to play out in matter. So it's not that that sort of vital question ever was gotten rid of. We actually just put it into the genome. So all that discussion, people had of vital forces before, now we just assigned to the genome. And we give the gene all sorts of intelligence and everything. And that's really not deserved. The gene is, again, an instruction set. What turns it on and off, and then once those protein products are made, what turns them on and off and regulates them, that is still an unanswered question. And so that leaves a door open for there to be other possibilities. So I think that's something that needs a lot more discussion, around the whole genetic, we call it genetic determinism, that you're basically just made of genes and they determine everything. And we're seeing so much evidence now contradicting that. I mean, it's been gathering for decades now, ever since the 50s when Watson and Crick characterized DNA. At first it was thought this was the building block of life. Everything comes from this. But now we have so many examples. So for example, the genome rearranging itself. It's like little arms come out of it and rearrange itself. It's really remarkable. It's kind of like Munchausen pulling himself up by the bootstraps, like that's kind of our current view. And everyone just sort of accepts that, like, that's just the way it is. And the science doesn't actually support that. It's pointing to a much more complex, more nuanced picture of forces arising from beyond the cell that help to regulate gene expression, cellular biochemistry, and then how cells organize. So those are the forces, I think, in traditional medicines. You mentioned the 5 phases. Those would be perhaps getting along the lines of what in ancient times people perceived as those higher organizing forces. These are the forces that organize the different organ systems. And, in those traditional views, and this is again deviating very strongly from our current conceptions of medicine. Like currently we think, you're a build of cells and the cells have genes and they arrange themselves in more and more complex forms. And so you're self-contained in a certain way. And of course we have food coming in and waste going out, air coming in and waste coming out. But in the ancient worldview, those forms, the organ forms and the patterns actually were perceived to not come from within you. They were something that actually came from extraterrestrial spaces, from beyond the earth. These were forces that the earth was permeated by, and that living organisms would absorb, and that this would enliven you and bring you not just life, but also the formative activity within you. And so that's a much more nuanced view, but that opens up the idea that maybe forces in the areas we call the zodiac have an influence on life. I mean, that currently is a question that would be laughed out of any sort of conventional medical sphere. But it is, if you begin to think about it from this other perspective, you begin to see, well, maybe a door is open for that possibility. Perhaps the lunar phases and so forth have something to do, maybe slight modulations in the geomagnetic field, and that influences life and so forth. And again, we're beginning to build some of that evidence from a more materialistic science. But that's something that is on the table now, is a possibility. So, I think most critics would say, well, no, you still haven't gone far enough to support that. I think that's true. We need a lot more work, but I think it opens up at least the conceptual basis around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you had previously mentioned that, around 300 years ago, not studying astrology would be considered a form of malpractice. And
in the Western, in Western medicine, the study of astrology, or and I'm not saying, learning zodiacs and all that, but the idea that extraterrestrial influences are important for understanding health and disease, that was a very core foundation of medicine. In fact, I think the last sort of medical school that taught that subject was, I think, in France, and it closed its program in the late 1800s. So up until the late 1800s, you had at least this idea that, more than just what is within you, and more than just the food you put into you, and so forth, governs your health. That we also have to look at these cosmic influences. And, I think the average scientist or even person in the public today would say, well, that's good. We got rid of that superstition. But, again, this is, I think, a question that we could, and this will maybe be a deeper discussion about, the role of science. What is science and what does that mean? But how these could be questions that we can put to science, that we could study and that we can measure. So I think, you know, before we dismiss that kind of stuff, we should really look at it in more detail.
So like a potential study would be like when, and I don't know a lot about Western astrology, but when Saturn, you know, moves in front of Jupiter, or, you know, maybe there's a, I don't want to misspeak, like, can we analyze, you know, the biorhythms and the physiology of, you know, 100 different people and see, you know, is there a pattern that, you know, emerges when these two specific planets are in specific alignment versus when these other planets are on a different alignment?
Yeah, I think, I mean, those are the kind of questions we can start asking. And you know, there are different, you know, approaches. Something we can talk more about is the approach of so-called anthroposophical medicine. And an anthroposophical medicine, you know, the assumption is made, and this is based on historical data and whatnot, that the planetary activity is actually reflected in different metals. And that we can look at the actions of metal salts with one another in certain ways before, during, and after, let's say, a conjunction of the different planets represented by those metals. And this has been done, and you know, you do see differences. Now, question would be, well, what does that mean, and how do we interpret that? But I think a deeper question would be looking at, and you know, my own area of study has been endocrinology. And the whole neuroendocrine system and how that relates to maintaining our physiology. And we find that the, you know, endocrine system, we can talk about hormones. You know, people talk about their thyroid, for example. Is your thyroid high or is it low? Well, that's one end of things. But in between that, you actually find that thyroid actually has its own rhythm. So, for example, the major marker of thyroid activity is a molecule called TSH. It's secreted by the pituitary gland, and it is what tells the thyroid to make more thyroid hormone. TSH, interestingly, has a 24-hour circadian rhythm, and so it's highest in the so very early morning hours, and it's lowest like in the afternoon, and it can vary by up to 50% in a day. So it's very interesting because we're now beginning to question, for people getting their thyroid tests, should you just get it at one time a day? Like if you get one test at 8 in the morning and one at 3 in the afternoon on different times, that's going to vary considerably. But the idea is that there's a rhythm behind that thyroid activity. And we find the same thing with cortisol. We find the same thing with sex hormones and so forth. So every hormone has its own rhythm. Some of them are so-called circadian, so they're 24-hour rhythms. Some of them are longer and shorter. So like the reproductive rhythms are more 28 days. They're synced with the lunar cycle. And even if you know, a woman's menses is not synced with the moon, the 28-day rhythm is still going on within her. So what we're beginning to see in maybe physiology 2.0 is that instead of just measuring biomarkers like hormone levels, we also have to look at the rhythms of those hormones. You know, you could have totally normal thyroid levels if you average it over the day, but maybe your thyroid level in the morning is considerably different from what it should be. Same with the evening. So that gives a whole different nuanced idea. And that's going back to those formative patterns, that they work not so much through, there's a spatial aspect, but they also work through time, a temporal aspect. And a lot of these more traditional medicines focus more on the temporal time aspect. And so when you brought up the discussion of the Chinese 5 phases, earth, water, wood, fire, you know, we can think of those actually as rhythms, as sort of frequencies in a way, instead of actual things, obviously. They're processes, activities. And that is really, again, this question of how do we move science beyond a discussion of just substances, which is the materialistic view today, And we get more into an approach looking at processes, activities, rhythms. And I think that would be the next jump in medicine. And that would allow us to really capture life activity more accurately. You know, life really is not I mean, if you look at a corpse on the table, the life is gone. And in fact, we can say there are physical energies in that corpse. There are physical forces, and the corpse really reverts back to a mineral state. It decays back to a mineral state. Whatever was animating that, you know, superseding those physical decay forces, that activity is gone. And we try to find, you know, in our current thinking, we're trying to find that activity in a substance or something material, in the gene or something like that. But really, it's not going to be found in a substance, I think. It's going to be more in looking at the rhythms. Life is really about rhythms and about how those rhythms are synchronized and harmonized in the right way. And my own impression, you know, giving so-called natural treatments, with herbal treatments, things like that, my thinking behind a lot of those is that they were really trying to restore the rhythms, the healthy rhythms of the thyroid or the liver or so forth. And that's something we have very little research on. It's a measurable, researchable question. So I think there's a whole field that can open up with that. And there's actually a field now of circadian biology, and we're calling it chronoendocrinology and chronopharmacology, looking at how the rhythms affect all of this. But as someone who's now tried to get into research a little bit, it's very difficult to get funding, that sort of thing, because it's not really what people are thinking about. They're thinking more about that gene or that protein or something that's going to solve disease X, Y, and Z. So this leads to, you know, a different view of disease that says that disease isn't so much a broken mechanism, a gene, or even the result of a toxin or something like that, or a germ. It's that a disease results from a breakdown of rhythms. And then we tend to see in those tissues toxicity, a germ, something like that. And this viewpoint has been historically known as the terrain theory of illness, that really illness is a breakdown of the terrain, not so much a result of a physical insult in a certain way. You know, both I think have very valid approaches, but like in the case of you know, the germ theory, we have the germ that comes in, but the terrain theory would say it's also the conditions of the tissues that have to be maintained. You have to maintain healthy immune responses, but it's even more than that. You know, it's about how is your liver rhythm, your kidney rhythm, your thyroid rhythm, how are they all synchronized? We don't really have good ways with technology currently to measure that. There's some examples of using salivary hormone tests or things like that. And we have heart rate variability to measure autonomic rhythms and so forth. But a lot of those rhythms, you know, are still, I think clinicians who work in that area are using a different sense to perceive the rhythms. You could say you have to step a little bit outside your intellect, and you have to work more imaginatively, more artistically to perceive those rhythms. And this is where, you know, modern science would be like, no, it's all about, you know, analysis and data points and finding that sort of thing. So in conventional medicine, you go to the doctor and you get a bunch of biomarkers. They take your vitals, but they also will take some blood, and they're looking for all these biomarkers. But we're not capturing yet in those tests, most of them, the rhythms of those biomarkers. That can be done. And I think with that scenario, I'm interested in working in more with data science, is how do we do that? How do we capture the rhythms and see that disease is not so much the absence or excess of a biomarker, it's the breakdown of the rhythm of those biomarkers. And then how can we develop techniques to resynchronize the rhythms of those biomarkers? And I think that would take us to a whole different level. Perception.
Yeah. Well, it's, yeah, how many years off do you think we are from that actually being the medicine of the mainstream?
You know, I think we're on the cusp of a big jump there, you know, with the, there's a current real interest in like wearable technologies, biosensors and whatnot. And, you know, that's gathering real-time physiologic data. The problem with like a blood test is you're getting one snapshot in time. And yeah, you can take the test every 30 minutes. That's a very invasive way of doing things. But even there, you're getting snapshots. Whereas you wear a continuous monitor to monitor your temperature, your heart rhythm, your blood pressure, these different things, you're able to get more data, and we can start to see patterns in that data. And we can start to tie those patterns to health and illness. So I think we're on the cusp of that as the technology improves for gathering that information. Again, historically, traditioners like in Chinese medicine are already doing that. You're feeling the pulse and as one of your diagnostic tests. And from that, you're getting a lot of rhythmic information about the autonomic nervous system, about your sympathetic parasympathetic tone, your blood viscosity, fluid volume, a lot of these things are not consciously discussed when we talk about pulse diagnosis, but that's what you're gathering. You're able to get a sense of what organs are doing, because the blood is coursing through all the organs. So we can say all the organs are like little chefs that are preparing the blood in its own specific way. And the idea in pulse diagnosis is you're able to detect those little changes. Of course, this is an art that requires, again, getting from an intellectual to more of an imaginative consciousness. You have to begin to get into the experience of that rhythm. But when you do that long enough, you do get this uncanny ability to feel someone's pulse, and it's like, well, that is not a good rhythm. Even though they might have, from a biomedical perspective, a totally normal heart rhythm, the tone on their radial artery and things doesn't feel right. And then you have to start to sort of ask, well, what's going on here? What could be contributing to that? But that gives us a whole different diagnostic thing. But I think with the wearable technologies, the people who don't do pulse diagnosis, which is the majority of the world, are going to have an ability to maybe start tracking some of those rhythms more accurately. And that will open up new approaches. So, we see that with people like, wow, this person, had this condition or that condition. I thought they were a picture of health. And from a biomedical perspective, from their blood tests and maybe radiological imaging, which just shows structures, you're healthy, you're fine. And I've had, so many patients over the years. They're tired, their sleep is disturbed, they're super anxious, they can't function. And all of their blood tests look fantastic. They look better than mine, when I compare it to what, things I had going on. And it was just like, wow, it's really remarkable how their blood tests are fantastic, but clearly this person is not functioning well. And again, what we tend to do then is attribute all that to the soul and say it's an emotional issue or whatever, and it's not medical anymore. But if we had technologies that could measure rhythms, we might find, wow, interestingly, your liver rhythm, your glycogen rhythm is completely screwed up. Your 24-hour cortisol rhythm is totally off, and your temperature rhythm is clearly disorganized. So maybe in 100 years, that's how we'll be talking about these things. And then we can see in real time, measuring those rhythms, how an impact of a certain therapy might have on that. So, you take an herb or a vitamin or a drug, and you can see how it changes those rhythms, either for better or for worse. So I think that's, that comes back to this question of what is science? Science really is it's just a mode of inquiry. It's an epistemology, you can say. It's a way of how we can take information from nature and sort through it. And it's really, you form a hypothesis and you form an experiment, and you test it. So it on the surface, this sounds fantastic, and this is what has created, our whole modern world, is applying that particular mode of analysis, the scientific mode of analysis. The problem that has happened is that people are beginning to equate science with a worldview, which is really not quite in the definition of science. That is more what we might call scientism. And that's the idea that there's in addition to an epistemology, you always have to have an ontology. What is your worldview? And the worldview of conventional science, which is really more of an assumption than some sort of foundation of nature, is based in mechanistic materialism. So when people are saying, yay science, what they're really saying is, yay mechanistic materialism. the world is made of matter. You as a human being are just matter. And of course, energy is the other end of that, matter, energy. And that the matter is connected through mechanistic principles. And that the third ism there, mechanism, materialism, the third ism would be reductionism, that we can reduce matter, like in an organism, down to the smallest parts, understand that, and then build that up to the whole. So those three isms define the ontology of modern science. Again, science itself should be neutral in that. It's just a mode of inquiry. Whatever your worldview is, if you can measure aspects of that, you can form hypotheses and test them. That's science. So that's a broader, or that's I think more the philosophical understanding of science. And science can never prove anything. It can just show whether or not your experiment is true or not compared to the data. So unfortunately, what's happened is, again, we tend to equate science with this ontology of mechanistic materialism. And so if something can't be measured in a mechanistic materialistic way, it's immediately dismissed as being important. So historically, when people have talked about the 5 phases and how they interact with the organs, that's something you can't measure currently with a mechanistic materialistic worldview. However, if you extend your worldview to say we also have to look at the temporal element, time and rhythms, those can be measured and they can be scientifically studied. They require more complex tools to do that, but it's not impossible to do that. And so, a lot of the traditional medicines, I think, can be brought to the level of science, not in a materialistic reductionist way, but by defining clearly what is your ontology or worldview, and what are the variables you're measuring, and then how do we, design the experiments to measure that. So I think science can be broadened into this realm to really go beyond just structures and form and substance, and begin to look at processes and activities. And that's really what we say the alchemists did. At the birth of modern science in the West after the Renaissance, we had a period of scientists like Newton, for example, who was mostly an alchemist. And he felt there was a material aspect to the world, but he also felt that there was a supersensory element, the more spiritual element, that interacted with that material aspect. And so scholars are kind of reluctant to admit that, most of Newton's scientific writing was not on mechanics or any of this kind of stuff. It was actually on alchemy and religion. And he was really interested in, we might say, the soul of matter. When you do an experiment, what are the inner processes that are awakened in your own inner life, both physiologically, but also psychologically? And so for people like Newton, there really wasn't an outer world so much as we have today, this outer versus our inner world, that they're both linked, that what happens out there, the thoughts and the feelings I get from matter are actually aspects of one phenomena. That's very different than our view today, which says that matter, when I think about something, like a glass, this is real, and my inner life, my thoughts about this and everything are not real. And that was actually an assumption made by John Locke and then Descartes in the 1600s, where they clearly, they separated subject from object. And they said that things like matter, weight, extension are real, primary qualities in the case of John Locke, versus secondary qualities like color and taste and so forth are subjective, and they should not be the basis of a science. That was an assumption that was made, and we have kind of embodied that in our scientific thought ever since. More traditional medicines, again, argue that actually both are important. That you have to look at the material, although a lot of more traditional medicines were not as interested in weighing and analyzing and dissecting. They're more interested in experiencing, the processes. When I ingest a certain herb, I feel a certain activity in my body. Oh, let's try that again on a different day, or let me have you try that. What do you feel? And that is a whole different way of gathering data. That data, we can say, has a certain objectivity to it, even though it comes from subjective experience. And that's another way of being able to expand science to include that sort of data. And that's what a lot of people that are involved in this kind of way of thinking, this is what they call phenomenological science. Phenomenology is really, I as the observer, what am I seeing outwardly, but also inwardly? And how do I link those two? And in the older traditions, like going back to ancient Greece and Plato and the Pythagoras, and even further back to Egyptian, and I'm talking about Western philosophy here, the idea was that the thoughts we have are actually coming from the phenomena. They're not from us. That when you stand in front of a plant and you meditate that plant, certain impressions come into you, certain thoughts, images are formed. And one of the art of ancient observation was to really pay attention to those images and say, this is not just me making this up. This is the plant thinking itself into me. And again, that is a very different approach than our current view, which says that, oh, it's just a thought I made up about this, and it could be right, it could be wrong, versus the plant is thinking itself into me. And as an observer and as a scientist, I should become very still inwardly and become very conscious of that. And in the process, it actually transforms me as a person doing science. So there's a whole different way of doing science that's based on that.
Yeah. So every time I chat with you, there's always 100 different questions that come up over the course of one idea. And I've got them all up here, so we can probably go back and revisit some of them. But something I'm wondering from that perspective, as far as looking at a plant and that is thinking its way back into you. So the thought you have is not necessarily, I didn't make this up, but it's more that I'm receiving it from somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, and it's an important distinction there to understand. And it's if you begin to practice these techniques, you can start to feel a difference. When is it when I'm receiving the thought versus me putting the thought into the phenomena? And that's something we don't really pay attention to when you, for example, as a clinician, see a patient. You have to be very careful. It's very easy to just project into the patient everything you want, that you were taught and you learn. Like if you think everyone has Lyme disease, then you're going to see that in your patient. If you think everyone is a genetic aberration, you're going to see that in your patient. So those kinds of biases in our thinking, that's part of the process of becoming a better scientist, is to learn how do you discern what I'm putting into it versus what it's thinking itself into me. And one person who really worked on these questions was the German poet Goethe, late 1700s, early 1800s. Goethe, we know, is a literary playwright and statesman and all this. But Goethe was most proud of his scientific work, where he tried to develop a science based on phenomenology. And many of Goethe's sayings are very clearly along this line of, having nature think her thoughts into us, not us controlling nature with our thoughts. And I think that's a very important distinction to make, but it's very difficult because it's very subtle.
So I think when we think about the practice of medicine per se, and being with a patient and really being there and open and receptive and not just projecting, our beliefs onto that person or trying to fit them into, they have, they're this kind of personality and they have this type of pattern, all that's maybe not so bad because it could help, provide a framework for how we're going to proceed with treatment, but not getting stuck in that and constantly being able to let that go and just be present so that we can receive and distinguish between that projection that might be coming about as a result of our training versus what's, I don't know, maybe true or what's just presenting in the present moment.
Yeah, and I think that happens. It's going on all the time when you work with patients. You're getting those kinds of insights mixed with your belief systems and so forth. And in a way, you have to have a conceptual container to make sense of any data that comes in. So if you don't have a concept of different things, it's not gonna make any sense. But there is a method that can be developed to hone this skill. And that's a longer discussion we can go over a different time, is how do you start with a phenomena like a plant or even a mineral or something, and how do you go through these different stages of knowing to come to the thought, to come to the archetype of what it is you're perceiving. And that requires practice, but it can be done in you can say a trainable way. And so that's where it can become somewhat scientific in that realm, and that it's teachable, it's reproducible, it can be measured and so forth. But that stage of moving from a fixed idea to maybe a bigger idea is difficult to cultivate, but again, it's trainable. And it involves almost dissolving your initial impression, just letting that go. So you notice it, you start to describe it, you see the kind of different relationships with that idea, but then you let it go into silence. And a sort of reversal has to happen, where instead of trying to actively do something, you step back and then it comes to you and you get a different impression. And then that has to be weighed, is that right? Is that impression right? And it's sort of a dialogue back and forth between the observer and the observed. So it's not like, where you're cut off from it. You're actually in this exchange when you're trying to arrive actually at the same thought. And it's a really beautiful kind of dance that goes back and forth. But it takes a lot of inner honesty and a lot of inner training to do that appropriately. Mm-hmm. And it's not like you can pass a multiple choice quiz on this. It's something that evolves over time. But I found clinically that I often get insights into cases that would not have come to me if I had just gone with what I already knew, or what even some of the basic data was telling me. Turns out a whole different activity was going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not always, I guess, not always what appears on the surface. And there's a certain patience to be able to step back and observe, but then let go, and observe, right, and then let go. And then over time, there's a pattern that perhaps comes up, or maybe sometimes you just get the insight and you just know that that's it. Like, yeah,
and I think this happens,
or whatever your framework is.
Well, that's it, but it's also it gives you a usable, testable insight. So that could be the use of a different medicine, or a different approach to how to take with this patient. It could be something that comes to your mind that you need to say to them. Where did that come from? I don't know, but I think I should say this to the patient. And you say, and they break down in tears, and they have this emotional epiphany, and voila, their pain is 80% diminished. These kinds of things do happen, and I've seen that happen many times. So it should give you something that's not just like, oh, that's a great insight. It's something that can be now translated back into the world, and it can be tested. And I think this is going back to that discussion of how do we expand science. This is a way that I think any good scientist does. They get into a dialogue with the phenomena they're studying. They get ideas. They work with those ideas. They test them some more, get new insights, work with ideas. So it's a constant dialogue back and forth. I think where a lot of scientists don't ask is, where are my hypotheses and ideas coming from? Again, most people say you're just making it up. But is it that the phenomena is speaking into you? And that if you create yourself as the right receiver, those ideas now will stimulate new activity. Ideas really are like living beings. And, you said, when we were talking about, you have all these questions that come up. I mean, that indicates that there's life in that idea, versus an idea where it's like you listen to topics like, I don't have any questions about it. and you just feel like you want to shrivel and die. I mean, that's a dying idea. But it's beginning to develop the inner capacities to perceive what is a living versus a dying idea, and so forth. That's what I'm talking about, is that's a whole different level of knowing than just looking at something analytically. And this will tie in maybe to a future discussion. I'm very interested now in, you know, the role of data science and big data and how that can help transform medicine. And I have a lot of, you know, hopes for that, but also a lot of reservations about that, because I think, you know, things like artificial intelligence and machine learning is emphasizing one particular mode of perceiving, but it is not able to capture these. I mean, you need essentially a human being to capture these higher insights. A machine could never do that. And that's why a machine will never, I feel, will never replace a doctor ultimately. However, the way we're treating the body and treating medicine is we're gradually moving into a machine-like phenomena. But that's maybe something we can talk about later. But yeah, I think this idea of how do we develop different modes of perception, different capacities of perception, is there a actual trainable, testable way of doing that? And does it give us useful insights that we can then reapply back to the physical sensory world? And so I think that's how this kind of approach might be able to expand that more.
Right. And I know for our listeners, and probably you've spent years thinking about some of these methods, but I know Rudolf Steiner once wrote a book, How to Know Higher Worlds. And I don't know if that's part of the methodology.
Yeah, very much so. I feel like I have to give credit, you know, to that. I mean, Rudolf Steiner, that's a very long discussion. You know, for those of you who don't know who Rudolf Steiner was, he was born in 1861, died in 1925. He was an Austrian, German-Austrian philosopher, I guess you could say. But he, you know, essentially started his career as, you know, training in the natural sciences at that time, so mathematics, you know, physics, chemistry, and whatnot, as well as literature. And he was asked at a very early age in his 20s to essentially edit Goethe's scientific writings for a major kind of national publication. And this really steeped him in that phenomenological way of knowing. And so from that, he developed a whole sort of movement that he called Anthroposophy. And Anthroposophy really is, you could say, asking this question: how do we start with what we know in the sciences? And that was very important for Steiner, that it's not about replacing modern science or whatever. It's that you extend modern science and medicine by applying these phenomenological insights. And so it's about extending medicine, extending science to include these other ways of perception and knowing, which are very important. And he basically said there are 4 basic ways of knowing, and this is a much broader discussion, but you know, what we usually call knowing and learning is the analytical way of knowing, which is, you know, analyzing things and piecing it together again through mechanisms. Another way of knowing, which should be more approaching the rhythms of life and understanding life itself. You know, the analysis method works very well from the mineral world and machines and whatnot. But to understand life, you also have to take those rhythms into account, and that requires a different way of knowing. Again, this is what he called imaginative cognition. It's able to perceive processes in time. And so in Chinese medicine, when you talk about cooling versus warming versus drying and damp and these different things, that's more using imaginative kind of cognition versus saying you have inflammation, you have this cytokine elevated, you have, you know, so forth. That's more analysis. A third way of knowing, which brings the feeling element more into this, and this would require a lot more discussion, is what he called inspirative knowledge or inspiration. So beyond just looking at processes, we begin to see feeling gestures. And that's discussed in Chinese medicine a bit as how the qi moves. Is it more expanding? Is it contracting? What are the different feeling moods I get, for example, when I am in the presence of a different plant or even the patient? I'm starting to feel really upset for some reason. What's going on here? Is this me? Is this them? What's going on? That's getting into inspirative cognition. And then that perceiving the archetype, when you have come to the highest stage, that's what he called intuitive cognition. And so 4 modes of cognition: intellect, imagination, inspiration, intuition. is what he argued that we can use to expand, all of our current endeavors. That would be from science to education to agriculture. So he applied this to all those different fields. So we have Waldorf schools and biodynamic farming and anthroposophical medicine and so forth. So I think Steiner was really a visionary, and I personally feel that it'll be probably 200-300 years before people really know, like, oh, wow, that was really someone. Like now, most people haven't even heard of him, or they write him off as some, quack. But Steiner, if you begin to really delve into the books he actually wrote, but he wrote about 30 books and he gave over 6,000 lectures, and many of them were transcribed. And if you just get into these, what he's discussing, you begin to realize he's starting to help people train these different inner sensory organs to perceive these different levels of the world. And when you apply those 4 levels of knowing, the intellect, imagination, inspiration, intuition, to a human being, you begin to see that we are more than just the physical body, that we also have a body of processes. We can call that the processes body. He called that the etheric body. But it's really, you can say it's based in fluid, all your fluid dynamics and the rhythms and the fluid. So we can say we have a solid body and then a fluidic body. And then inspirative knowledge, your feeling perception, gives you insight into a third body, which he called the astral body, but we just call it the feeling body. And then the intuitive knowledge gives you the direct intuition about the person in front of you as an actual spiritual being, as an independent I. And that is based more in, a more subtle element. Say the astral body is more gaseous, air-like. The etheric was fluid, the solid was solid. But the perception of the spiritual core of a person is more based in warmth. And so we might call that the warmth body. So 4 modes of perception reveal that we as human beings are actually 4 bodies in one: a solid, a fluidic, an air, and a fire. And the ancient Greeks call that the earth, water, air, fire bodies. An ancient Greek would come to today and say, well, you guys are really good at earth. You've gotten earth down and you're getting it, but you suck at water, air, and fire. I mean, to be blunt, like those areas are just not well developed. And the ability to perceive fluidic processes, gaseous and warmth processes, is something that is not really part of medicine currently, but it could be. And Steiner argued we could expand science to include that.
And just to give folks listening like a sense of these different bodies, I'm wondering, like, let's just take, for example, a patient interaction. I'm wondering if you could describe how like each of these bodies would manifest, or we would perceive them,
Yeah, I mean, that's a longer discussion. And people do it today as well, although I don't know if they're conscious of that. So, the physical sense is able to relate, everything you can see physically or touch or whatnot as a solid something. That's what the physical sense gives. And again, that's where a lot of medicine is based right now. So if you feel sick, you go to the doctor. Again, they measure solid molecules in the blood, biomarkers, or they do imaging to look for a structure. A lot of patients like, something's really wrong with me. I really need a CT, an MRI or whatnot. Okay, let's say they get the imaging and there's nothing on imaging. They're like, oh, I'm fine. Okay, good. And they go away, but they still don't feel well, So there's something else going on beyond the solid. So the fluidic would be really an experience of the life activity in the person. Again, one would be through appreciation of rhythms like pulse rhythm and all the other rhythms we can gather, sleep, wake rhythm, and so forth. Also the sense of like the life in a person. Do they look withered? Do they look full of life? And then, we can start to get a sense of how that fluidic body is behaving. Is it more of a heat phenomenon? Is it more cooling? Is it contracted? Is it more diffuse? And so forth. So that's appreciating the fluidic body. And so a lot of the descriptions in traditional medicines like warming and cooling, drying and dampness, that's talking about the fluidic body and what's going on there, life processes. And then with the gaseous body, that's your emotional body. That's really how your emotions are playing out. And, maybe where unresolved emotions or things you sort of tucked away are having an impact on your physiology. And we can start to get into more of a phenomenological language and say in nature, you know, you have a fluid body like a lake, and then it's the air that moves it, just like the emotions are moving your physiology in a certain way. And they can move it in a healthy way, or they can move it in an unhealthy way. And then addressing the core identity of a person. So addressing them as a spiritual being, as an I, that would be getting to the sense, the intuitive sense, in addressing the warmth body. And, you know, that's really about, we can say that the consciousness body, the astral body, you know, brings us consciousness, but then the I body brings us self-awareness, self-consciousness. So that's the part of you that can witness and can be able to, in the patient, for example, in meditation, you can go in and say, as you get more relaxed, you start those blocked areas of your consciousness body start to bubble up. And you start to see those emotional patterns emerge. And then just by the warmth of your attention, that can help to transform them. And, you know, this could be where the provider, you know, you witnessing this, you can engage your warmth body and provide a safe haven for them to do that. So a non-judgmental, loving, caring space where they can carry out that activity. And that's how you can utilize your warmth body, you know, to participate in that. So there's a lot more aspects to that, but that's maybe on a superficial level how we can begin to think of those four bodies. But it's kind of an interesting meditative exercise to almost imagine a person in front of you and then dissolve away in meditation. They're solid. Everything that's solid in you, dissolve that away. And that's only about 30% of you, you know, you're mostly fluid. And so then you have this body of fluids, gases, and warmth, and it has organization in it. You know, your warmth is not just randomly distributed. Actually, if you look at thermography images, it's very organized. And then you can imagine dissolving the fluid away and just seeing in front of you a person that has organized gas and warmth. And the experience you often see or experience when you start to meditate on that gas body is that there's a certain inner light to it. And that's where historically people have equated that with the aura, or one aspect of the aura. You know, so different emotions have different colors in your gas body. I would argue if we could develop a special camera that could take a picture of your gas body physically, you'd actually have a picture of your emotional state. Maybe that's something, technology that will come someday. But how you breathe in the air rhythms, but also the rhythms of the gases in your blood. I mean, we now know that many gases beyond oxygen and carbon dioxide, like hydrogen sulfide, nitric oxide, and whatnot, these are physiologic gases. And they have structure around different organs, and they help organize different organ activity. And then the warmth body, that would be the last thing, dissolve everything else. Just imagine yourself as standing warmth. So that's a little meditative exercise, very difficult, kind of unusual to think about. But that would give you an impression of those four different bodies.
Well, that's homework for me and all of our listeners. So.
All right.
Yeah, I know. I just, this is for my own curiosity, but just like goals and, you know, like somebody's goals or intentions and even like beliefs about the world, is that all a part of the I? And
yeah, so let's say I make an intention. I want to lose 10 pounds. You know, that's sort of an intention. Of course, then you have to put that into more practical things, like I'm going to do that by X, Y, and Z. I'm going to exercise more, diet, whatever. You know, so you set that intention in your warmth body, and then you have to essentially impress it into the gaseous body. So you can say the warmth changes the gases away. Now, I'll just say one thing here. A lot of people are saying, well, warmth is just a product of matter. It's not independent of matter. Interesting, in the traditional senses, they argued it was separate. There's ways of perceiving that in different ways. I won't go into that right now. But the idea that if you just think of warmth as an actual entity, fire, the fire element, that can impress upon the air and the gaseous. And by the way, in Chinese medicine, one interpretation of air is that it's what they call the wood element. I can speak on that more later. but that the air element changes, your emotional changes. So that would be essentially, I have to now make the schedule, I have to now get the feeling element. So it's not just having intention, it's having the feeling of really wanting to do that and the motivation to do that. And it's said that, you know, in these more traditional spheres that it takes about a day, or within a day you can change your eye, you know. It takes about a week to get that impressed into the gaseous body. But now we have to get those gaseous forms impressed upon the fluid, change your organ processes and so forth. It has to form a sort of memory in there. And in fact, a very interesting observation that comes from anthroposophy is that our memory is not something that's, and this is coming from biomedicine too, there's no one area in the brain that stores memory. Memory is a distributed process, but it also is distributed through the whole body. And it's distributed through your fluid structures. And that would be a whole lecture in and of itself, is the unique fluid structures in our body, in the cells and extracellular spaces. So we have to impress that feeling into a memory activity. And that is said to take 1 lunar cycle, so about 30 days. So you have to go about a month before you can impress that in there, doing the same activity over and over to impress it. But
that fits with Western science as well, saying it 28 days to form a new habit.
Yeah, exactly. That gives you the memory. But now to actually change the physical body takes 1 year, 1 solar cycle. So that's why it's difficult to use intention and manifestation and the secret, you know, to change these things, because you have to go through these different levels. And of course, the more you do this, the quicker you can say things become. So a lot of people have already in their astral or air body a lot of, you can say, emotional blockages, beliefs, or long-held feelings about why you can't do X, Y, and Z. And so if you just impress a new thought on that, like, I'm going to be this, and your astral body is saying, no, you're not, you're this. The astral body, which many will call the subconscious mind, is sabotaging that. And so you have to go through with conscious intention and begin to transform the astral body to get rid of those blocks and to transform the blocks. And that is where you can begin to, you know, now move it into the fluidic and deeper. And the more of those blocks you clear over time, the quicker this process can become. So that's why the secret, so-called secret, you know, about manifestation, you see all of that now. YouTube is blowing up with manifestation channels. It's more than just saying affirmations. No, that you have to go through all these different levels, but it can be done. And anyone that is a successful conscious person is doing that, you know, sometimes not with intention, but they're doing something along those lines. You have to make a plan, then you have to really formalize that plan, you get the feeling built up around it and the energy and the motivation, and then you get into your memory, and then you get it into the physical. So we can say it's moving down the different chakras, if you want to talk about that, or it's moving through these different subtle bodies.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, having that perspective, I think is helpful, because it, you know, it gives you a sense of the work that needs to be done in order to actually take what you want, per se, or maybe what you're receiving as what you want,
right,
and putting it, you know, into the earth and making something happen.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's, again, we can say it's the thought, the intention comes from a supersensory place. And this is a really interesting thing to think about. What is a thought? It's non-material. Now, a lot of people say, well, your nerves are your thoughts. Well, no, the nerve is not a thought. The nerve fires in relationship to different thoughts. And our current thinking in physiology is something called the neural correlate of consciousness. So basically, your thoughts are just the epiphenomena of nerve activity. So you got the nerve activity, which is real, and then the thought is something more, you know, unreal. The opposite would say that actually the brain is more of a receiving station for the living thought, and that the thoughts, we receive them into us. And That's an interesting discussion to look at, for example, the brain structures, and to look at how, for example, on the cerebral cortex, like in the motor cortex, you have all these neurons that are lined up in these like pyramids, and they send their dendrites to the surface of the brain, and what they're really listening to is the pulsations of the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's almost like the thought first changes the rhythm in the fluid, and then the nerves pick up on it and you become more conscious of it. So the idea that the brain is more of an antenna for thinking, and that these thoughts are realities in themselves, but they're non-material. They're supersensory. They come from a different dimension. We'd say it's more the spiritual realm, the heaven world, and that we receive them into us. And then we have to translate that thought down, down, down into matter. So you have a thought of a house. To actually get that into the matter requires a whole bunch of steps. And you know, all the steps are important. So it's not just about having the thought, it's about also being able to translate that thought into the physical world. And so it's, that's, I think, when I listen to some of the manifestation videos and whatnot, sometimes they miss that part. You know, they're like, you know, have the thought and just think this and you'll be, you know, you'll levitate the world. Well, I think there comes a point when those thoughts can very quickly translate down into matter, but you have to really transform your own matter to a very high degree to be able to do that efficiently. So most of us have to work more slowly. We have the idea, then we have to make a plan, then we have to communicate it, then we have to get, you know, finally get it out there. But the process is the same. And it does say that, yeah, the thought is a living thing, and that we're receiving it in a way. And we as human beings can be a mediator between what we might call heaven, the world of thoughts, and earth, which is the material, the matter. And that we are in a way responsible for bringing certain thoughts into the world. And the question we always have to ask is, what are the thoughts that we're channeling? You know, are we even conscious of where those thoughts are coming from? And that opens up a whole nother can of worms, is who is inspiring those thoughts into us? And I think we'll probably not talk about that today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question of our own intention then, if we're receiving these thoughts, you know.
Right. You
how
can set
do
the
we
intent.
choose, yeah, who,
Tuning
like,
the antenna. Right, yeah.
yeah, like what should we be tuning into consciously? And I don't know, maybe
Exactly.
that's, you know, a question for people just to sit with.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can come back and revisit that. But yeah, that's an important one. You know, who or what am I tuning into right now?
And then I think another question, and again, maybe people can just sit with this one, but is like, what is the influence? You know, I know people these days, or at least in the alternative medicine crowd, a lot of people are coming back to astrology and like looking at the different planets and where they are in relationship to the earth. And like,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I think that we have to really back up and provide a bigger framework for that, because the way I think astrology is currently being presented has a lot of limitations. But I think we have to, first of all, create a framework to see how can cosmological influences impact a human being. You know, these more subtle bodies I just spoke about, the fluidic, the gaseous, the warmth, are they more open, especially the fluidic body, is it more open to extraterrestrial influences, lunar, solar, and whatnot? And again, if we think of the endocrine system, that is really, on a deep level, that's what regulates your fluidic body. And so the rhythms I spoke about earlier are images of the reflection of those cosmic rhythms within us. So yes, in a way we internalize those rhythms, although again, going back to like the menstrual cycle, you know, a woman can internalize the lunar rhythm and not have to be in sync with the outer moon. She carries the lunar activity within her, but it has its own rhythm. But if now she starts getting desynchronized, you know, that's where you hear about a very helpful practice is to go away from lights, go into nature and sleep under a tent for a few days, and now you resynchronize yourself with those outer influences. And this kind of push to get back to nature and forest bathing. I mean, we can say that's really opening your fluidic and potentially other bodies up to those external rhythms to resynchronize, because in the kind of modern urban environments, no one pays attention to that. We get desynchronized all the time. So yeah, so it begins to open up that question of how cosmic bodies and cosmic forces can open to that. But it requires going beyond just saying, for example, Jupiter is that planet in the sky. We have to say that Jupiter activity is a rhythm, really would encompass the entire orbital space of Jupiter in relationship to the Earth and the Sun. And that starts to bring in all sorts of complex mathematics looking at those relationships. And we can talk a bit about, for example, Venus is a fairly easy one to study that way. And Venus forms, for example, in 8 years, 5 near and far conjunctions with the Sun in relationship to the Earth. And so in space, it actually traces out a 5-petaled star. And it's very interesting that, you know, in ancient cultures, people assigned planets to herbs or herbs to planets. And there were herbs of Venus, herbs of Mars, herbs of the Sun. And herbs of Venus were often depicted as having a 5-fold symmetry, like the rose family. And so it's almost like if you take that complex orbital structure of Venus through time and imprint that into matter, you get a rose. So that's more complicated than just saying that's this planet that gives some extra energy or something. I don't think that's correct. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And that's where I think some of the modern astrology falls a little short on understanding that. But yeah, like we can talk more about that in the future.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure our listeners, myself included, will be very interested to hear more about those connections.
Yeah, I think especially in Chinese medicine, I mean, really Chinese medicine is all about cosmological science. If you look at the classics, it's all about rhythms. The 12, the 10 heavenly stems and the 12 earthly branches. The earthly branches from ancient Taoist cosmology really were an impression of the Jupiter cycle versus, and potentially the lunar cycle through the lunar mansions. And then the 10, the heavenly stems were essentially a solar cycle, the 10-day solar cycle. And so, all of the calendar and agriculture and medicine was seen as something that you essentially need to synchronize yourself with the cosmos. And that was in China, but the exact same thing was in, the early Western cultures, in India, around the world. And so this is something we have really lost today is, I know people who, practice medicine and couldn't care about where the moon was or what's going on there. And today we say that's totally normal. But again, 300-400 years ago, people would be like, question that doctor. Do you understand this? That these cosmological forces actually impact physiology. And the question is, how do we really approach that in a kind of reproducible, but also really structured way? Because right now you have people saying all sorts of things and they're often contradicting one another. And then it just becomes more of a belief system than a real science that way. And so I think if we discuss that, it'd be good to try to start from more foundations and build up to maybe look at how we can integrate that.
Yeah, great. Well, it's lots of exciting topics for the future. I'm wondering if there's anything more you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up for the day.
I mean, I think one thing we could provide would be, some of I talked about the meditative exercises, for example. I mean, some of that is captured in some of the Rudolf Steiner writings and other works. And I think that's something we can maybe provide in links in the description of the video. So if people are interested in reading that, and, it'd be nice to maybe have these discussions build on one another. So if people have gone and read some of this between the videos, they would get a little bit more insight into what I'm talking about here. But the one book you mentioned, How to Know the Higher Worlds by Rudolf Steiner, is a nice place to sort of start to get a little introduction to that. And then another one that he wrote called Theosophy talks more about those subtle bodies a little bit more in more detail. But they're very widely available and they're available for free online. And we can put that in the link down below.
Right. So interested listeners can do a little bit more research into these,
Yeah.
methods for quote unquote how to know higher worlds, but also just to learn more about, these different bodies and how they function as a framework for integrating, everything in a sense, whether we're talking about the Chinese five phases or cognition or emotions or physical sensations or sub-physical sensations or even the subconscious. We've related to one aspect of the astral plane.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, an interesting way of looking at human evolution is to say that over the last 10,000 years, we have gone from consciousness that was able to perceive more in that warmth gas realm and perceived archetypes and intelligences. This would be the gods and goddesses, but also more of a shamanic type consciousness. And then we gradually dipped down and down, and then we got into the fluid body, and that's where Chinese medicine that's currently encoded with the phases and all of that discusses. So that was, circa 200 to 400 BC. In that area, started to dip down into that. And then we dipped finally, after the Renaissance in the West, into the physical matter. And we've really gotten into that. In fact, in the 20th century, we even went below that into subatomic nuclear physics. So we went to submatter. But now I think there's a trend to try to go back up again a little bit to see, okay, well, let's not just look at mechanical relationships, which we see in the physical, but let's also look at those processes, whole systems relationships, which you see more in the fluidic body. So we're moving slowly towards that. I think there's still a push to go further down into matter. But it's very interesting how even scientists are beginning in certain fields to acknowledge the limit of that particular approach. In fact, in quantum physics, you go into that subatomic, and now you begin to start to get back into the more of an interconnected everything kind of realm. And it's all very different. Yeah, so you kind of go through one end and out the other side. Right?
Yeah, it's kind of like those old video games where, not quite, but where you disappear off one edge of the screen and then you appear on the other.
You come right back, right? Yeah, and I think we're kind of doing that. But I think the difference is, 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, people, we can say, were very perceptive of the fluidic and the gaseous and whatnot, but they were not conscious of it in the way we're conscious today about, for example, the physical world. They didn't have the same kind of clarity around that. And I think we can come back to those realms now, having dipped into the physical side of things, and bring that clarity that the scientific method and this sort of thing has given us, and now start to apply that to the fluidic, to understanding processes, but then even into the gaseous, emotional, and even higher realms. And so we come at it with a much different type of consciousness. It's more self-aware versus just being like right now, you don't notice you're breathing air, you're just in it. But, you start to realize, oh, there's air, what is air? What's in the air? And so forth. And so it gives you a whole different perspective on things.
Yeah, and even a choice like, what kind of air am I breathing? Or can I tune my senses to breathing in or tune my eye to breathing in the pure substance out of the air?
Right.
Which I shouldn't go too far into, but
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so it's bringing more a different type of awareness. And in fact, Rudolf Steiner was very clear on that although to a lot of people today, especially in more traditional medicines, it seems like we've fallen away from authentic knowledge, which was able to perceive those higher realms. He argued it was necessary for people to fall into matter so that they could consciously now go back to those realms and re-perceive them. And in that process, we actually gain freedom. We become more free. And so for him, the evolution of consciousness and knowledge was about how to gain more capacities and become more free in our thinking, but also our feeling life and our willing, our action life. So I think that's very a different take on, that notion that somehow knowledge was the golden age 5,000 years ago or whatever, and we fell from that and we have to get back to that. It's not quite like that. It's that was certainly a golden age in a sense that people perceived on levels that we probably can't comprehend today. But now that we've fallen into matter, we seem like, from that perspective, it seems like we're in a dark age, although all the proponents of materialistic science would say this is the best age ever. And then, but we're heading into a new age, which can reapproach that former golden age, but with new tools and with new insights and with new freedom. And I think that's really encouraging. I think that says that, it's not all doomed, although things look pretty bad at certain times. Again, I think what's happening now is more of just like a melting pot that has to boil over. And then in alchemy, you always have this process where you crystallize something, and then you have to redissolve it all again, kind of like we talked about with the thoughts before. Mm-hmm. And then in that redissolving, a new thing crystallizes out. And that's different than what the previous crystals, the polarities in the previous crystals were. So now something new is coming out. And I think that's absolutely what's happening right now in our greater culture.
Well, it's a very exciting time and kind of an encouraging message, I think, for lots of people to hear, especially when, this last year is,
people need encouraging messages. I mean, it's been very dismal. If you look at it purely from a more material perspective, it's very dismal, but if you bring this idea of transformation, evolution, and consciousness, more of an alchemical worldview, and then it creates new possibilities.
Great. Well, I think, probably just for those listening in right now, we'll put some of those links we talked about in the description below. And I think, a good homework apart from doing more research on the different bodies would be to start thinking about them and just kind of categorizing, things into, this is the warmth body, or the eye, thoughts, what have you, or this particular process is more part of the emotional body.
Yeah, I can, maybe next time we talk, we can go more into some of those actual experiences. Like warmth is not just physical warmth, but it's also emotional warmth. If you're interested in something, you're warm to it. If you don't like it, you're cold to it. And you're constantly going back and forth this way. And so you get into that experience of how am I projecting my warmth? Even in my thinking, when you think about someone, am I being cold towards them? Am I putting warmth around them? And if what we're saying is true about there being maybe higher worlds in a sense, or different dimensional worlds, what you think and what you feel is actually happening in those worlds. That's a reality. And we're just usually not very conscious of what we're doing in those worlds.
Yeah, that's, I think something to sit with. I think for most of us, we're, just on the glimmerings of awareness of those worlds. And
sure, yeah.
Yeah, I know with and probably I should stop talking, but I know with like the warmth body, for example, if I'm focused in on a task and I get into it and I create, there's a coherence of thought, and I'm moving into what I guess, might be called a state of flow. All of my physiological processes start to smooth over. I feel good. I start to feel warm, and it's not so much, it doesn't matter so much like if there's a heater on or not, things are just moving and warm, and I'm kind of in harmony with whatever I've set my mind to.
I think that's a pretty common experience in meditation. At first your thoughts are noisy and whatnot, and then as you get more relaxed and your breathing starts to synchronize, I always experience there's a moment when I just feel this flush of heat. Like suddenly my ears warm up and I feel more warm. Like, that's, we can say physiologically, that's your circulation now, your sympathetic nervous system relaxing and your circulation is more diffusing. But the experience is one of warmth, and that's, that always tells me I've gotten to that next level of meditation, when I hit that stage.
Mm. And there might be some like resistance or something entering into it, or, it might take a few minutes or, you know,
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it takes me an hour to get there, but others it might happen in a few minutes.
yeah, I guess depends on what you're working through and,
Right.
how difficult, whatever that is. And then
Yeah.
you hit that sweet spot where, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like getting all your rhythms harmonized and then the warmth can slip in, So that's what you often see with treatments like acupuncture. It's harmonizing the rhythms. And now the warmth body can slip in and now it can do its work. In fact, that's a longer discussion about how you can improve acupuncture by during that relaxed time. Now this is when people can do their meditative work on maybe examining some of those emotional issues they were not able to look at before and so forth. The problem with just doing the rhythm reharmonizing is you reharmonize the rhythms, you get back in the car, you drive over the Ross Island Bridge at rush hour, and you get home. The kids are yelling, and all your rhythms are off again. So it's difficult.
Yeah. Well, I think definitely as practitioners, I think some folks will start to do that naturally, but I think definitely as practitioners, we can create a space of encouragement for people to maybe go into those spaces or provide
Right.
some basic education. Here's,
Right.
what you can do. And,
Right.
obviously if you have a bunch of, needles in you, you probably naturally go into that state. But
Really anywhere else, right? Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, I think, yeah, we can, yeah. Is there anything more you'd like to share with our listeners before we tune out?
No, I think that should be good for now. I think we can come back and maybe revisiting the four bodies and the different modes of perceiving, and maybe going more deeper in this question of what causes disease in that way of thinking, but also how the bodies taken together really can help us define this older concept of terrain, biological terrain, which is, I think, a very important one today, especially when contrasting that with more of a germ theory kind of viewpoint. But the idea that we have to have all these different bodies harmonized in a certain way to create the right physiologic but also psychological inner state. And that we now are beginning to have, again, the technologies to measure that, but also the tools to work with that. You can say we've always had them, but we have to update them for the times.
Yeah. So this idea that in a healthy body, disease cannot exist or is less, maybe that's too strong.
Well, it's more, I mean, we can talk about a disease as an actual entity or thing like we do in biomedicine. So define signs or symptoms or biomarkers or whatnot, that's a disease. Versus more of a terrain approach, which says that it's a result of a disharmony. And once you resynchronize the organs and whatnot, then that so-called disease process can exist. So the disease is more of a sign of a disharmony, not the cause of the disharmony. Mm-hmm. And I think we often get that mixed up in medicine. What's the result of something, and then what's the cause of it? And that's interesting to think about in the context of germ theory. Very controversial right now, but the idea of is the bug really the cause of an infectious illness, or is it also the conditions of the terrain that we have to consider? And that's where discussions of nutrition and lifestyle management and so forth come in as well.
Mm-hmm. And this is also, very much where like something like Chinese medicine operates on, as far as this person's spleen is weak and therefore they're unable to, at least in the Chinese system, metabolize fluids, or their digestion is off. And that's why having this phlegm, very phlegmy cough, not, the phlegm isn't the disease per se, or it's not, it's not the cause of it.
Yeah, and in modern biomedicine, we'd say, you have a weak digestive function. Let's say you have some functional pancreatic insufficiency, you're stressed out, so you don't make enough, digestive enzymes. So you don't fully break down your peptides from your protein meals, and some of them leak into the blood and they potentially trigger immune reactions. And you know, interestingly, the biomedical spleen, the actual organ spleen, is where the body senses those antigens and trains the immune system to either become tolerant to them or to become reactive to them. And then, yeah, you might start seeing more as a biological reflex, more phlegm production or something. And now microbes that often are just inherently on you anyways find a place to grow. And so then we interpret that as you caught this illness and then we have to destroy the microbe. And certainly that approach in some instances is necessary. And I've seen that clinically where that's what you have to do. You have to address the microbe. But usually along with that, I find you have to support the terrain as well if you want a full and lasting kind of recovery from that. And that's identifying those organ processes, for instance, that need to be strengthened or that maybe are going out of bounds. And we can talk about that, you know, it's actually finding more of the balance between the excess and deficiency that the real healing happens. But that's a much more involved question. But yeah, that's all looking at terrain as something versus the agent, whether it's a toxin or a food allergen or a bug or something that is causing the illness. And even in the you know, integrative or complementary medical circles, you see a lot of emphasis on the so-called causative agent. The idea is if you just get rid of that agent, you'll be fine again. But I think it's always important to reemphasize that in addition, it's important to support the other end, you know, and that's to look at your endogenous physiology and whatnot. And that's always, you know, it's a much more difficult place to come from because everyone's so highly individualized. You can't standardize therapy for that. And so it's much more complicated when it comes to actual implementation. But I've countless times seen clinically how if you don't support that other side, I mean, classic example is urinary tract infections. You know, there's a lot of factors that we can talk about later that go into that. But it's not just the E. coli or whatever bacterial agent is causing that's causing the urinary tract infection. You can say that's more of a consequence of a dysregulated bladder immune terrain. And that immune terrain depends on what your liver is doing, what your pancreas is doing, what your thyroid is doing, and all of that. So part of the thing I always looked at was what, in addition to just giving antibiotics or an herbal antimicrobial, can I do for this patient so that this problem, which comes back every 4 weeks or whatever, doesn't keep going. And so I found that was a much more useful approach than just the antimicrobial approach.
Great. Well, it seems like, you know, it's medicine. I mean, obviously it's an approach that's existed for a long time, but also one that's going to be needed as we move kind of into the future. And it's perhaps one of the pieces that's been missing in our modern Western approach.
We discussed, this is why we're trying to do this here. Yeah. One place. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, my name is Motoyuki, and this is Dr.
Kalnins.
Yeah, and yeah, and we are Enlivened Medicine.
Enlivened Medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, seeking the spirit of matter. You got that right? Yeah.
We can go with that. Sure. Yeah.
Or we'll figure it out.
Bridging science and medicine or something along those lines.
Yeah, bridging science and spirit, new approaches to integrative medicine.
Spirit, right, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, if you tuned into this, thanks so much for listening. And if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the comments below. We'll be sure to look at them and hopefully answer them in some of our upcoming videos and discussions. Great.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye.
That way. And Venus forms, for example, in 8 years, 5 near and far conjunctions with the sun in relationship to the Earth. And so in space, it actually traces out a 5-petaled star. And it's very interesting that, you know, in ancient cultures, people assigned planets to herbs or herbs to planets. And there were herbs of Venus, herbs of Mars, herbs of the sun. And herbs of Venus were often depicted as having a fivefold symmetry, like the rose family. And it does say that, yeah, the thought is a living thing and that we're receiving it in a way. And we as human beings can be a mediator between what we might call heaven, the world of thoughts, and earth, which is the material, the matter. And that we are in a way responsible for bringing certain thoughts into the world. And the question we always have to ask is, what are the thoughts that we're channeling? You know, are we even conscious of where those thoughts are coming from? And that opens up a whole nother can of worms, is who is inspiring those thoughts into us? And I think we'll probably not talk about that today.